Morning. Reading today is taken from the book of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 22 to 33. Jesus walks on the water. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, where he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat was by this time a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against him. And the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." And Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, beginning to sink. He cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took a hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat whispered him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Amen.
Good morning. Sometimes when you see a message title in the bulletin, you think that sounds interesting, but I couldn't necessarily pinpoint the specific Bible event or story or passage that the message will be referring to. This is not one of those messages. And I think just from the title, even without hearing the scripture reading, everyone should already know exactly what event will be the primary focus. And I'd like to talk about well-known events, well-known biblical events, because the more well-known they become, the more they transcend kind of the Christian sphere and move and integrate themselves within general society. And the more these events integrate themselves into general society, they become either metaphors or they become stories or they become proverbs, and the more their meaning ultimately gets diluted. Because if we just talk about a secular context, walking on water certainly exists in the English vernacular. But it means something that is impossible, something that is divine. And I'm going to say this morning that that's not the point of the biblical story. That Jesus is not walking on water to show off his powers. There is a lesson in there. And going back to the vernacular, going back to the secular world, there are two common ways to use the expression. You can either use it in a negative sense to highlight someone's limitations. He's rich, he's powerful, he's whatever, but he can't walk on water. Or as a positive metaphor to emphasize capability. I feel so good today that I feel like I could walk on water. The expression, as we know and as we've heard, comes from the scripture, takes place immediately after Jesus feeds the 5,000, which is another well-known event that maybe has lost a bit of its original meaning in the secular world. And Jesus walks on water not just that because he could do it, but specifically to return to his disciples. And if we only think about the idea of walking on water as evidence of divine power or as accomplishing the impossible, we lose the purpose of walking on water. That Jesus isn't showing off his power to his disciples. Walking on water is a means to an end to reach his disciples. And that in itself And the whole sequence is a metaphor for Christian life and the intersection of trial and faith within Christian life. As with most biblical events, as with most biblical narratives, the miracle is used to demonstrate more important ethical or lifestyle lessons. I would like this to... So we start with the setup that Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side of the lake. It's referred to as a sea, but it's a very large lake, while he dismissed the crowd. After he dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. Later that night, he was alone, and the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. All three accounts in Matthew, Mark, and Luke are pretty uniform in their descriptions. In all three accounts, the disciples encounter trouble after Jesus departs. Mark, in particular, takes care to emphasize that the disciples are not stuck on the sea, on the lake. They're not stuck because they're not trying. That their problems are by no fault of their own. He describes Jesus as seeing the disciples straining at the oars because the wind was against them. And so the accounts are portraying something that I think we can understand. It's a struggle against a force that doesn't have a face to lock onto, doesn't have anything to be pinpointed as an enemy, doesn't have any weaknesses that could be potentially identified, doesn't have any opportunities for you to try and harness or control it. It's just nature. It's faceless, endless, and beyond our power. And so, as a reader, and as a human being, as an individual, it's a very easy experience to associate with. Even if you've never been out on the water, even if you've never been in the boat, you have encountered situations where things were simply out of your control, where there was no real way to make life easier for yourself. So everyone can understand that feeling of rowing against the winds and the waves and not really making any progress, despite the fact that you're not making any mistakes and you're trying your hardest. Sometimes things just don't work out. So this is where Jesus arrives. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. "It's a ghost," they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, "Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid." So faced with this scenario, faced with a situation where they can't do anything, they're probably racking their brains trying to figure out, what do we do here? Are we all going to die? Is there a way we can row harder? Is there a way we can row more strategically? How much time do we have? Faced with all of these thoughts circulating in their heads, the disciples panic when they see something that they don't expect to see. Because if you're stuck on a lake, I think the last thing you expect to see is someone walking on the water in the middle of a storm coming towards you. And so when Jesus arrives, they don't recognize him, and they think that he's a ghost. They don't recognize him, not only that they don't recognize him as Jesus, but they don't recognize him as the person, the mortal person that they've been with for weeks, if not months at this time. They don't recognize him as someone familiar to them, and their minds jump to the supernatural. Their minds jump that whatever they're seeing can't be part of this mortal plane, as it were. Jesus doesn't rebuke them for this. Jesus simply understands their impulses and tries to calm them down as best he can. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, of course, as readers, if the disciples slow down and think for a second, they would recognize that, one, it is Jesus, and two, that this isn't out of the ordinary for Jesus at all in the slightest. That Jesus is not just performing one miracle in the physical act of walking on the water and not sinking, but he's performed another miracle because he's found them in the middle of a lake, in the middle of the night, during a storm, from miles away. And we live in modern society in the middle of a city, so it's quite easy to lose sight of the idea of light pollution and just what pitch darkness actually feels like. But if anyone's, again, ever been camping, if anyone's been out in the countryside in the middle of the night, they will have an idea of just what pitch darkness actually means in a situation where you can't necessarily see 5 feet in front of you without a flashlight or something like that. Certainly, there would be no stars because we're in the middle of a storm and there are clouds in the sky. So Jesus has found them from miles away in the middle of a place with no light and no geographical landmarks, just straight in pitch darkness. Jesus downplays the incredulity of what he is doing. He treats walking on water, he treats finding the disciples in the middle of nowhere as perfectly normal. And that's because it is perfectly normal for him. But the gospel writers also take steps to emphasize just how normal this is. There are no flowery descriptions, there are no reactions of how are you doing this? There's no attempt to hype up the event, to use a modern expression. It's just a simple one sentence, one verse. Shortly before dawn, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. It could very well have said, shortly before dawn, Jesus opened his front door and got the morning paper. Like, that's how blasé this whole sequence is in the text. And because of that, the point is not that Jesus is walking on water. The point is that Jesus, despite being far away, despite being physically apart from the disciples, automatically knows that the disciples are in trouble. And that Jesus, despite being physically apart from the disciples, can reach the disciples with minimal effort, with no strain, with no difficulty. That the point of the miracles, the point of the sequence, is to show that Jesus is always there to provide help when his people need him. Mark, interestingly, in the 6th chapter of Mark, verse 48, highlights that Jesus was actually about to walk past the disciples, that Jesus was almost on a stroll to rejoin his disciples, but wasn't going to intervene in their struggles at that particular point. The implication is that Jesus is there. He's watching, he's present, he's more than capable of acting, but he doesn't necessarily intervene unless the disciples themselves ask or that Jesus deems it to be necessary. And this reemphasizes the intended teaching point when combined with the other gospel accounts. That God is always with you, whether you necessarily see him or not, whether you necessarily recognize him or not, whether you realize or acknowledge it or not. That God is always there and always has the capability to help. And with this in mind, then how the disciples react to Jesus is an indication and a reflection of their faith and how it holds up during stressful situations. They're panicking, which is natural. But again, if we think about it, they had also just seen Jesus feed 5,000 people with next to nothing. They have seen miracles. They have just seen a miracle. They have just seen people wonder in amazement at a miracle. they should logically infer that a man who can create food from nothing, essentially, can probably also walk on water and could probably also, and as he goes on to do, calm the storm. But the disciples, in their panic, fall back into the ways of the world, where if they don't understand something, they automatically, the impulse is to go and make this thing that I don't understand into something to be feared or something to be cautious of or something that would bring harm. We do this as humans when we try to explain things that don't necessarily make sense to us. We fall back to things like luck or concepts like karma. We try to incorporate non-biblical canons into scriptural doctrine. When scriptural doctrine doesn't make sense to us, we try and make it make sense by incorporating things that humans have come up with human logic, and that's not the way to go. And then Peter enters the scene. Peter says, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come to you on the water." And so Jesus replies simply, "Come." Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. Peter gets a lot of negative attention because we know how the story ends, that he starts sinking and Jesus rebukes him for his lack of faith. And that kind of, in our minds, because it's the last thing we see or the last thing we read, gives us a negative impression of Peter, that he's doing something wrong. But Peter is the only one who gets up in the boat. Peter is the one who challenges Jesus in accordance with what he's supposed to do as a faithful Christian. He is in compliance with what John writes in 1 John about testing the spirits. But importantly, Peter does not tell or ask Jesus to prove his power. Peter does not ask Jesus to prove his divinity. He tells Jesus to prove it by showing Jesus' love for him. Peter's logic as he leaves the boat is, the real Jesus, because the real Jesus loves me, the real Jesus will not permit me to drown. Peter is literally staking his life on his belief that this is Jesus and not some sort of spirit or demon before him. Because if he's wrong, he's going down in that lake. And so we have the conclusion of the story. When he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately, Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. "You of little faith," he said, "why did you doubt?" And when they climbed in the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Peter stakes his life on his belief that this is the real Jesus before him. But he also stakes his life on his desire to be closer to God, because he is staking his life that God will allow him to walk towards him, that Jesus will allow him to walk towards him. Peter fails. He does fail. We have to acknowledge that. But he doesn't fail because he changed his mind. When we say something like, "Oh, ye of little faith," it kind of implies that you've changed your beliefs, or that you've lost, or that you've changed your mind or something like that, or that you've lost what you originally held to. Peter wavers not because he stops believing that Jesus is Jesus before him. He wavers due to external forces, in this case, the wind. And the text is very clear in explicitly stating that. When he saw the wind, he was afraid. Not just he was afraid and beginning to sink. This happens. We have to acknowledge that this happens, that external forces do challenge our faith and possibly even shake our faith. Not necessarily by causing us to change our fundamental beliefs or change our minds or anything like that, but simply by distracting us from what's, really important. Life gets in the way, and I think that's an expression that we're all familiar with. But when Peter fails, yes, Jesus says, "Oh, you of little faith," but he's also there immediately, as the text says, and the text again makes it clear with that word, immediately. He is there to save him. He doesn't let Peter flounder in the water. He doesn't let Peter tread water for a little while. He doesn't let Peter sink. He doesn't let his head go beneath the waves or anything like that. There is no test or challenge or punishment. He just saves him immediately. And Jesus doesn't abandon Peter to the waves when he wavers, nor will he abandon us to the waves when we waver. And we're not delusional or proud enough to say that we will never waver. So it's very nice that we can take this message from this passage. And then ultimately, we tend to stop reading after Peter gets rebuked. But what is the end result of this whole story? What is the end result of this whole event? It's Peter and Jesus walking on water, side by side, heading back to the safety of the boat. Peter does get everything that he wants. He gets his proof that Jesus is Jesus. He gets his ability to walk on water. The only thing he doesn't necessarily do is do it by himself, but that's not important. He gets to go back to the safety of his familiar place, the boat. He gets to go back to all of his friends and his companions. He even gets the storm to go away, because that's what happens once they get back in the boat. So I showed a picture earlier at the beginning of an artist's depiction of this event. And in it, the disciples are sitting in the darkness and Jesus is illuminated on the water. And I don't necessarily like that juxtaposition, although it's a very common interpretation. I don't necessarily like that juxtaposition because it sets Jesus apart from the disciples. It sets Jesus as something separate, something good, whereas the disciples are something bad, cast away, as it were. Instead, I prefer this alternative interpretation, where we still see Jesus shining as a beacon on the water, but we also see Peter almost sprinting towards him with his posture and his pose. And I think the ultimate take-home message from all of this is that walking on water is, while it is something in the realm of the divine, as it were, it's something that Christians try to do each and every day. Just as Peter tried to do something that he knew he couldn't do by himself in order to pursue something that he wanted, we too, in our desire to follow and to pursue Christ, have to do things that we by ourselves would fail at. This is why we have Jesus in the first place. This is why the law by itself was insufficient. That in order to try and follow God, we need help, and we can't do it by ourselves. And Peter's attempt should not be treated as a failure. Peter succeeds in everything he sets out to do. He manages to succeed through God's help, through Jesus' intervention. And in the same way, we can reap all of the rewards that Peter, I don't know what the past tense of reap is anymore. We can reap all the rewards that Peter reaped if we remember, like he does, that God is always there to protect us, and that if we trust that God can calm the storms in our day-to-day lives and pull us from the seas that threaten to pull us away from both God and our end goal, which are one and the same.